So just to give you a quick idea, this book talk series, the one called Spatial Practices, is co-organized by myself and also Dr. Pan herself. Both of us are interested in the notion of space because we see that that can be an alternative approach for us to investigate how scholars in the field of art history and visual studies has been approaching different historical questions that center around notions of space, for instance, through ideas of landscape, locations, geography, cartography, and monument this time. And secondly, both of us are very interested in exploring technology of online conferencing, especially in the time of the pandemic, to create a new platform where scholars and also anyone interested in art history and visual culture can get together to learn about some of the new publication and also to discuss how a spatial approach of doing research can offer us a new perspective in understanding history and also visual culture. So today we are very honored to have our own and also Dr. Pan Lu, Associate Professor at the Department of Chinese Culture, to share with us her book, which is called Image, Imagination, and Imaginarium, Remapping World War II Monuments in Greater China, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2020. So let me now hand the time to Dr. Pan for the very inspiring talk, which I believe will be. All right.
Thank you. Move myself. Okay, thank you so much for Libby and Kathy's introduction. Thank you, all of you in Hong Kong, join me face to face. I really appreciate your time. Okay, so I will start to share my screen. Wait a second. Okay, I hope you can see it clearly online too, and I think you can see it here. Okay, so yeah, this book is like I think I spent more than 5 years on this book since the very beginning, and of course my relation with war monuments is even longer. So this is really a crystallization of what I like to say about war monuments, especially World War II monuments in Greater China. So this is the title of the talk as well as the book. Oops. So in Great China, I think the modern idea of monuments came hand in hand with the region's various bloody experience of modernity, revolution, colonization, wars, and massacres in the same century. The vicissitudes of political circumstances in 3 Chinese societies in question, namely mainland China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, have created critical moments of the changes, which exerted great influence on how World War II is narrated through monuments respectively. So, so what are the changes? The monuments in mainland China experienced, firstly, the shift of the main subject of history writing of the war after the nationalist communist civil war between 1945 and 49. And secondly, China's own ideological shift in the post-Mao period. In Hong Kong, the British colonizers established the mirror images of its own historical memorials. The handover of the city's sovereignty from Britain to the People's Republic of China in 1997 is undoubtedly another turning point for its commemoration of World War II. In Taiwan, monuments have always been caught between constant rewritings of historical subjectivities by the politically powerful, first the Japanese colonizers, then the nationalist government. Since the mid-1980s, the democratization and the de-Sinicization led by the Democratic Progressive Party, DPP, in the early 2000s composes a new political myth around the war. I consider there are 3 major characteristics of this book that marks its difference from previous research on war monuments in the region. Firstly, instead of investigating the monuments from the perspective of their written narrative, it focuses more on the visual and aesthetic context of the monuments and their implications in political and historical significations. And second, rather than putting mainland China at the center of the war narrative, it is interested in the extent to which experience of World War II in Great China can be seen as both interrelated and isolated, so as to question the writings of a war memory constrained by the boundaries of sovereignty, ideology, and nation state. And third, this research takes the present as the observational vantage point from which both historical and current developments of the monument are studied as an integrated whole. So in this research, I focus on the monuments that are or were dedicated or adapted to commemorating the heroes or victory of World War II. And they are the Cenotaph in Hong Kong, which is very close to Maritime Museum, and the War Victory Stele, or now more commonly known as the Liberation Stele or Jiefang in Chongqing. And this is the Army No. 1 India-Burma Corps Memorial Military Cemetery in Guangzhou. I'm pretty sure most of you haven't seen it before, but it's still there. And the National Revolutionary Martyrs Shrine in Taipei, which is a tourist spot. And the Shanghai Sihang Warehouse, or now the Sihang Warehouse Memorial Museum. And so these are the 5 cases and the 5 chapters of my book. So the first question you may ask about this book or this research is why these 5 monuments? First of all, the 5 monuments are closely related to their surrounding space and in turn the entire cities where they are located. As a result, a large part of the book is not only about the monument per se, but dedicated to the discussion of the production of its surrounding space, in the process of which the monument may be reinterpreted, re-highlighted, forgotten, hidden, or renamed. Mutually inclusive, the history of a monument is embedded in the city's history, while the city space was also produced by the monuments. The monuments' relations with the city are also reflected in the relations they have with their visitors and spectators in the public space. And second, the 5 cases of Chinese war monument typify and illustrate intriguing monument of creating visual languages of modernism in 20th century China. There were 3, I think, major modern visual forms of the monuments in China in the first half of the 20th century. The colonial or eclectic modernism that was transplanted directly or with minor revisions from the colonizing state or the Western European countries, for example, this one in Shanghai, which was already demolished. And the Chinese classical ritual style that tried to, I can zoom in. Okay, this is the first style. And the Chinese classical ritual style that tried to combine the Wuxia art order and the grandeur of the memorial space planning with over Qing Chinese palace style. So this is the Sun Yat-sen Mausoleum in Nanjing. And a localized style of a more universal modernism, which was deeply influenced by the practices of Bauhaus and other functionalism-oriented architectural trends in the 1930s and 40s in Europe. So this is a really rare case, but my book includes 2 of them. This one is the cemetery in Guangzhou. There are competitions among these 3 styles. For one thing, with the establishment of the foreign concessions and colonies since the defeat of China in the Opium Wars and the Navy Wars with Japan, Monuments became one of the most direct ways of power manifestations of various forces in Chinese cities. For another, the KMT-led New Republican Chinese government also sought to communicate their legitimacy and power to the public. And the last style, namely the localized style of a universal modernism, was relatively peripheral. But exactly because of this peripherality, I would like to emphasize its importance as an alternative aesthetical power to the dominance of the other two. Thus, Chinese war monuments are also characterized by its contested discourses and forms of visual style that reveal the impossibilities of having only a linear, unified, and purely native form. Sorry. And lastly, considering them as a physical, symbolic, and imagined objects that were produced by struggles of power and their entanglement and multi-layeredness, I would characterize World War II monuments in Greater China with an often observed marginality among other monuments in their respective societies today. From the wartime to the post-war period and then to the post-Cold War present, the complicated matrix of power contestation in the region originated from a series of international and domestic political maneuvers, such as British and Japanese colonialism and imperialism, the civil war between the nationalists and communists, the Cold War reshuffling of friends and foes during World War II, and the post-Cold War transformations of all societies' domestic political narratives. As a result, the public memories related to the war do not proliferate. Instead, they are perpetually replaced by some more urgent war or political narratives and end up being selectively deducted. In this process, war monuments as the medium and agency of representation of this memory designed by the state are also subtracted and are marginalized visually, discursively, and sometimes even physically. So here is a quick timeline of year of construction of all the 5 monuments. So thus, I carefully choose the 5 representative cases that may divulge the transformations of World War II monument commemoration from the immediate post-war years to today, thus placing the research at a point from which historical trajectories can be examined in the present. All of the 5 cases have their own kind of marginality and uncertainty in their meaning. They underwent ups and downs, remembrance, and forgetfulness. At certain moments, they are iconic representations of national memory, while at other moments, they were ruins torn between high visibility and total invisibility, and visited by intended and unintended audience. Meanwhile, despite their distinctive historical and social context, the aesthetical and the spatial manifestations of the 5 monuments are not divided, but interrelated in their visual dialogue and intertextuality. Okay, so the 5 cities and 5 monuments. So I will begin to talk briefly of 4 monuments, but I will spend a little bit longer time on the case in Shanghai. Okay. So first I will start with the cenotaph in Hong Kong. Hong Kong cenotaph, designed by British architect Edwin Lutyens, blends classical revival and Roman Greek form and reviews how the UK established its network of imperial symbolism in its colonies in the early 20th century. The cenotaph was almost an accurate replica of the Whitehall cenotaph in London and was completed in 1923 to commemorate the fallen in World War I. So this is basically the same design as that's in London. The cenotaph was erected on the Statue Square, which was once dotted with statues of Queen Victoria and other royal family members, the statues of them. But after the Japanese occupiers who defeated Hong Kong Defense Force, they removed the statue for making more cannonball in 1941. The stone cenotaph remained the only monument on the same spot throughout the war. So the Queen was gone. And after the war, the grand unveiling ceremony of the cenotaph symbolized the rebirth of Hong Kong in the resumed British colonization in 1945. And since then, it also functions as a World War II monument, so two war commemorations. So since the 1950s, nevertheless, its visibility became increasingly low. And this is because the British Hong Kong government, on the one hand, intended to create an image of modernity in the city center by downplaying the previous strong symbols of the empire, and therefore no pre-war statues returned to the Statue Square. So you may wonder why this square is called the Statue Square, but there's almost no statues. On the other hand, the government also began to recognize the importance of the Chinese community's involvement in the war commemoration. In particular, after the anti-colonial 1967 riots, to neutral a new post-war Hong Kong identity. So at the annual Remembrance Day ceremony, the Hong Kong governor paid first to the visit to the Memorial Arch in memory of those Chinese who fell in both world wars before going to the cenotaph. And this is the Memorial Arch in Hong Kong Botanic Gardens. And so in the 1960s, another memorial shrine was also built near the cenotaph for all those who, regardless of their religion and race, defended Hong Kong against the Japanese invasion. And after 1997 handover, major ceremonies that commemorate the victims of World War II moved to this shrine from the cenotaph. And the ceremony was basically not open to public. A move that can be interpreted as an intentional forgetting of Hong Kong's colonial past. But there were also other kind of rituals that still like held around the cenotaph. I also discussed that a bit in my book. So quickly, I will move to Guangzhou. And, so this is an image of the Chinese expeditionary forces on the Burma Road, and this is the name, the new First Army. Okay. Coming to Guangzhou, I will show you an invisible monument. Okay, so General Sun Liren, one of the most famous military leaders of the nationalist army in the war against Japan in China and Burma, decided to build a monument for his fallen soldiers of the Army No. 1 India-Burma Corps soon after the war in Guangzhou. And the original design of the cemetery consisted of three major sectors. The entrance, here, this is the entrance, had the two columns and the two gatehouses. So you cannot see the gatehouses, but actually there are two small houses besides. And further up the hill, it's built on a hill, on the avenue, one could find a memorial pavilion and a pond in Chinese garden style. I will show you the pavilion later. And finally, one saw the gigantic geometrical structure as the main body of the monument. And this is how it looked like. The monument was designed by Chinese architect Guo Yuanxi, who also hosted the reconstruction of the Chinese Lamist temple, the Polata of Jeho at the 1933 Chicago World Fair. The design combined a highly abstract image, if we go back, of the non-decorative stele consisting of 4 stone columns or towers. And there was an eagle that actually is the like the sign of the army. Okay, built in front of, mounted in front of the tower, the main monument. And also, aesthetically, I'm also wondering its connection or its similarity with this German pavilion in the International Modern Art and Technical Expo in 1937 in Paris. Okay, so you can see the entire design is somehow similar. And but after 1949, however, the Chinese expeditionary force, to conceal the monument erected by the KMT enemy, the PRC government located the main part of the monument tower within a militarily restricted zone, which bars the public from seeing it. The monument was not demolished; it's still there, but the eagle has long disappeared, probably during the Cultural Revolution. And in the early 1990s, a hotel was built just next to the southern side of the monument. Here is a hotel built. Most incredibly, a toilet was even built in between the four columns as an extension of the hotel. With the development of the area, the whole garden was split up by newly built roads and highways. And today, the memorial pavilion was housed in an indoor wet market, with few people knowing what it is. And one of the two gatehouses was destroyed, and the other became an underwear shop as a part of the wholesale garment market around that area. It was still unknown what the monument would become, even if there were, changing narrative of World War II in China, in mainland China. But this case, in any case, shows the difficulty of remembering national war memory beyond the contested Civil War narratives. Okay, so let's move to Chongqing. We all know that Chongqing was the temporary capital of China, Republic of China during wartime. And so there were actually efforts of building war monuments during the war already. So the Victoria Stele was the only official monument that was built by the KMT right after World War II to celebrate the victory in 1946. It is located in the center of an inland Chinese city, Chongqing, which served as I said, the temporary capital in wartime. And Chongqing served many devastating air raids by the Japanese and was also a pivot for the military collaboration between China and the Allies in the battlefield across southwest China and also Southeast Asia. And during the war, on the same spot of the Victory Stele, a temporary structure named the Spiritual Fortress, this is how it looked, was already erected in 1941. And in my book, I also talk more about the name of the monument. It's related, very much related to this campaign called, spiritual mobilization during wartime, launched by the Chiang Kai-shek government. While the spiritual fortress resembles a smoke signal in the military tradition of Asian China, the main component of the new monument built after the war, which is the Victory Stele, was a four-faced clock, a weather van, and with four reliefs on the top, which apparently alluded more reference to the European aesthetics of the monument. In turn, the Victory Stele shows a new way of constructing imagined community. How I will tell you later, but I will also tell a little bit about the design. The design of the Victory Stele embodies an architect whose name is Li Lunjie, and he actually migrated to Hong Kong after the war and stayed here until his death, but he got no chance to practice any other architectural design work since he moved to Hong Kong. And so Li Lunjie, he actually, he has this idea of building this air defense city inspired very much by modernist urban planning in the 1930s to 40s Europe. And what is really interesting about this monument is underneath this monument, in the foundation of it, a time capsule consisting of many interesting objects. For example, the design sketch of the monument, newspaper and magazine of that time, stamps, photos, literary works, an open letter from the US President Franklin Roosevelt to the citizens of Chongqing, a reel of 16mm documentary film that captured the images of wartime Chongqing were buried down underneath. However, after the civil war between the communists and the nationalists, in 1949, the Victory Stele was soon renamed by the Communist Party to Liberation Memorial, which remains today. So the original inscriptions of Chiang Kai-shek on the Victory Stele and the name was removed. In Chinese, the Liberation War was immediately associated with the Civil War. And so the original purpose of the monument was thus forgotten. Okay? It was not until recently that the previous life of the monument was inscribed on a copper plate near the monument. But there are other places where you can find the monuments. A replica of the original spiritual fortress and the Victory Stele was found or was reconstructed in a film studio on the outskirts of the city, where the anti-Japanese TV dramas are shot and tourists are welcome. So you can see this is almost like a theme park where you can see of course, it's a much more smaller version of the Victory Stele. So the theme parkness of the recreation of the monument reveals interesting relations between war memory and the cultural consumption of nationalism in China today. Okay. So Taipei, okay, in the design of the Martyrs Shrine, according to its designer Yao Yuanzhong, took Liang Sishen's Qingshi Yingzao Zeli or Qing structural regulations as the major reference. Like many other new architecture built after the nationalist government takeover of Taiwan, the shrine was patterned after the royal architecture in Beijing. And the transported architectural style became a very highly strong visual image to the public about the nationalist-led government's political will and power on Taiwan. And so especially, I think a lot of buildings, monuments, or big large-scale architectures built around time were also very much related to the Chinese Cultural Renaissance movement, which was almost at the same time of the Cultural Revolution on mainland. So the original site of the Martyrs Shrine was actually the seat of Gokok Jinja, a large Shinto shrine built by the Japanese colonizer in memory of their dead soldiers in 1942. And the demolition of the Jinja and the erection of the shrine aimed clearly at exorcising the past colonial ghosts. The shrine echoes with another significant landmark in the vicinity, the Grand Hotel Taipei. And the hotel, which is easily recognizable with its highly repetitive elements of the Northern Palace style, replaced the Taiwan Grand Shrine, the highest ranking Japanese Shinto shrine in Taiwan during the Japanese colonial rule. Today, the political contestations between the colonial past and the post-colonial present seem to be oblivious. Okay, the Yuanshan area where the two landmark architecture lie are more easily associated with new cultural facilities in the area, such as the Taipei Expo Park, Taipei Story House, or the Taipei Fine Arts Museum, which are more related to contemporary image-making agendas of Taiwan with its own history and culture, rather than solely an embodiment of the ROC. But in Taiwan, you can also see in the case of, for example, the Grand Hotel, if you go to the hotel, you can find this golden dragon in the Golden Dragon Hall, okay, which is now a restaurant. And this dragon was actually taken from the Taiwan Jinja, okay, but it was repainted in golden color, so as to conceal its previous life. Okay. So in Taiwan, I think that the history of colonialism had rendered the writing and preservation of World War II memories extremely contentious due to the controversies over the successive regimes from the mainland in their own post-colonial appearance. While most of the martyr shrine constructed by the Nationalist Party before the retreat to Taiwan were destroyed during the Cultural Revolution in mainland, ironically, the ones in Taiwan now become a tourist attraction for travel groups from the mainland and even from Japan. Okay, finally, opened in 2015, Sihang Warehouse Memorial Museum is an architectural relic where the fierce and famous defense of Sihang Warehouse during the Battle of Shanghai in 1937 took place. However, for a long time, the warehouse was barely used as a commemorative site in Communist China's war memory narrative. And so it was quite a modernist architecture designed by a Scottish architecture firm Atkinson in Dallas. The warehouse conjuncts up interesting link between the transnational architecture modernism and modern warfare. The warehouse lies between the Chinese area and the US-British settlement in Shanghai, rendering an optimal position for the defense of the Chinese army against the Japanese fire, which hadn't declared war against the Western powers at that time. So you can see this is the warehouse, and here is the river. The images of Sihang Warehouse were among the most widely circulated war images in photography and also film in China and even abroad. So I will focus on first photography. These images can well illustrate the making of Sihang Warehouse as an iconic image of national resistance. And the images of the Sihang Warehouse found in most of pictorials published between 1937 and 1945, certain elements of the Sihang Warehouse are repeated. For example, a complete view of the warehouse from the southern side of Suzhou Creek, around 1 kilometer away, is always accompanied by the portrayal of a photograph of Colonel Xie Jingyuan and the national flag of the Republic of China flying on top of the building. This standard layout of that consists of the warehouse, the flag, and the colonel's image constituted an entire narrative of the battle. So to compare, we can see images from the Japanese perspective, for example, on the left-hand side. In these images, Sihang Warehouse is seen only partially and in debris. The pictorial portrays the warehouse as a conquered fortress. The monuments of occupation are represented as moments of victory, and the space is less emphasized than the action of the soldiers. And the other photos are from an American whose name is Hailan Liu, who sojourned in China between 1934 and 1941. This image served as another reference for comparison. So he is more like a journalist. So the stunning realism of these images provides a spectacle of war violence, illustrating the warehouse on the verge of destruction. Now, I will spend a little bit more time on talking about this painting, and because our series is more related to art historians and the visual studies scholars. So this painting by Liu Haishu. So on the left-hand side, so I visited this Liu Hansu Museum in Shanghai several years ago, and the original is hanged on the wall as a part of their permanent exhibition. And so the painting actually had its debut on the cover of a magazine called the 美术界, the first issue of a journal affiliated to Shanghai Art College, where Liu was also head of that, published in the Japanese occupied Shanghai. In the Liu Hansu Museum, art museum in Shanghai today, there is a tag beside it, and there was a quote of the account from a friend of Liu Hansu, who is another quite famous Chinese artist, Wen Zhaotong. And so Wen Zhaotong, he claimed himself to be the witness of Liu's 写生 or life sketch excursion that produced this painting. And he said, okay, I saw Liu, live sketched this scene. Okay, if you remember talk last week from our series, Gu Yi also talked about 写生 a lot. However, several points of details may cast doubts on one's account about this 写生 excursion. If it was an outdoor sketch by Liu, the year should be maybe 1 year earlier, because the flag was there in 1937 instead of 1938. It's a bit blurred, but you can also see it's 1938 rather than 37. It's painted there. And another puzzle is the relation between the painting and the photographic images that bear high similarity in composition and perspective with, for example, this is only one example of these photographs. And so they appear very frequently in magazines during and after the war. Okay. But my main goal here is not to determine whether Liu copied the photo. The possible misbelief or mistake of the museum or Wen Zhaotong may reveal something more about how different media of representation of reality are bound up with the making sense of the community and the nation. In this regard, my opinion is that the keywords are 写生 and 写实, okay, life sketch versus realism, and their discursive meaning in the early 20th century China. Liu's painting on Sihang Warehouse echoes with the discussion on the new realism that at that time in many ways. In 1936, Liu wrote a long essay addressing the young Chinese painters. The essay is called On Revolutionary Ideas of Art, 艺术的革命观. In this article, although Liu did not mention the term new realism directly, his argument on what art is and what it is not also deals with the inner self of artists and the reality of the outside world. So here is the quotation from Liu's essay. So he said art is an expression of the decoration and what he believes. So I want to highlight the last sentence here. So he said, if you see a thing and faithfully reproduce it, then the work can only be a documentation, or in Chinese he says 摄录, something related to photography, and just as in photography, 照相, that is what he is talking about. So coming back to the painting of the Sihang Warehouse, on one hand, the propagandistic impact of image is relatively weak actually, and thus real. If one had no knowledge of the context of the Sihang Warehouse battle, then the painting would seem like an ordinary landscape painting. And the name of the painting is also not Sihang Warehouse. It's called 1938, 1937, something like that. So on the other hand, the painting can be viewed as a rememorization of the battle and the symbolic landscape through a remediation from photography to painting. The painting speaks precisely to Liu's denial of a perfect photographical documentation as art. Thus, the painting is a representation of his own memory and perspective of the building, with his subjective interpretation of the scene and his specific use of color and form in this painting. Of course, I spent longer time discussing the form in my book. So when all media were competing for exposure and power in the visual narrative of the war, the painting and its possible transition from photography also posed another question. Facing the same war scene, which has more right to claiming access to reality and war memory, a speedy documentary captured by photography and camera, or an oil painting produced at a certain remove in time. Interestingly, I think Liu's painting found an isolated but also partially free space in the Long Island when the painting was painted and also published on the journal, where he might be developing an uncertain and aloof relationship between himself and the massive absorption of art into the national war propaganda machine at that time. And so between the immediate post-war years and until very recently in 2015, Sihang Warehouse was basically not very much remembered as a war monument. It was later, used as warehouse again and was rented to different companies for business purposes. So it was not until 2015 when, on occasion of the 70th anniversary of the end of the war, victory of the war, that the museum based on this architecture was opened. So what is interesting about today's Sihang Warehouse Memorial Museum, if we look at them today, lies in the fact that the facade of the building with bullet holes after the battle were simulated and refurbished as artificial war ruins. If we compare the wartime photographic images of the war and the current museum, we can observe a direct inference of the visual representations of a warehouse at that time. Okay, for example, this is the Japanese postcard after the battle. And this is two screenshots from a film made by Kamei Fumio, who is an army filmmaker who came to Shanghai and made all these documentaries, of course, for propaganda purposes, but his films were also censored domestically, so because of his more humane touch of the films. So you can see the ruins images of the Sihang Warehouse from the wartime representations of the warehouse. So according to the museum director, I interviewed him. So he said that the purpose of the ruin images in today's museum is to bringing back the historical scene or 重回历史现场. And even if it is simulated, the simulation indicates that a new method of making contemporary Chinese war commemorative space is at work. Affected by the Western dichotomy between the original and the copy, the Chinese monument builders do not appear to be bothered by the first-handedness that constitutes the idea of authenticity in Western cultures. A kind of image centrism, which I define as the pursuit after visual resemblance, rather than object centrism, that is, to recognize the original historical object over others. So this image centrism prioritizes a motion picture-like spectacle, and truly so, because these bullet holes were remade under the supervision of the masters of props of the August 1st Film Studios, the 8制片厂, the most important military filmmaking institution since the establishment of the PRC. While these monuments were designed and made by authorities with a designated intention, the actual monuments change and obscure their original meaning and even spiritual structure constantly as they renegotiate ideals, status, and entitlement. Interesting examples can be found in contemporary art in Asia to deal with the issue of a war memory from artistic or the people's perspective. In the case of Taiwan, photographic works of Japanese artist Motoyuki Shitamichi and Taiwanese artist Cao Liangbing render an interesting pair of efforts in remembering the same commemorative space by way of art. Shitamichi's photographic album or collection, Torii, or the entrance of the Shinto shrine, tried to search for and even to reconstruct the traces of the disappeared Shinto shrines built outside mainland Japan during wartime. So you can see this is in Tainan, this is in Changchun, this is in, I think, in Korea, and this is somewhere in Russia. So he tried to trace all these torii without the Shinto shrines because most of them were demolished. And so how, for example, the gate was used as bench in Taiwan in a park. And in comparison, Cao's work contrasts old photos shot around the Taipei Shinto shrine from private and also archive collections with new photos he took of the shrine converted Chinese martyrs shrine. So after the war, many Japanese Shinto shrines that commemorates Japanese soldiers were directly turned into shrines for commemorating Chinese soldiers. So you can still see the structures left from the previous, colonial period. And in both works, they seem beyond. We see beyond the abstract and monolithic meaning of the monument that are assigned and intended by the monument builders. Rather, we see the artist's efforts in showing the state of monument, which includes everyday life, people's memory, and the changing environment of the monument. And Hong Kong artist Li Kai-chong also made video work called The Retrieval, Restoration, and Predicament, utilizes a voiceover that takes the first-person narrative from the perspective of the removed Queen Victoria statue, telling her journey from Hong Kong to Japan and back to Hong Kong during and after the war. Now, in conclusion, I think the book aims to, firstly, display the unspoken politics of Chineseness and the denial of it, legacies of Western or Japanese colonialism and their influence on the narratives of World War II memory in the region. Second, as monuments are also fundamentally a form of visual and haptic artifact in the public space, the project also aims to examine the relations between their visual forms and the way they shape broad public political consciousness in public space. And thirdly, it asks how we can redefine the idea of a war monument in the region. In fact, though the book's 5 chapters are written, on different monuments in different cities, the memory of each monument is sometimes shared across the society, and sometimes the cases are interconnected at certain moments. In terms of visual memory, after the Battle of defending Sihang Warehouse, filmmakers in Shanghai, Hong Kong, and Taipei, they produced films, all of which were named 800 Heroes or 800, based on the battle. And they were produced in 1938. Actually, there's another Hong Kong film in Cantonese, but I cannot find its image. So there were 2 films made based on the battle in 1938, right after the battle. And in 1975, you have another, also a very famous version of 800 Heroes made in Taiwan. And then more recently, you have this film made in mainland China again. And so you can see this memory is also very much shared by all 3 Chinese societies. And in other cases, the same group of soldiers were commemorated by several monuments. For example, KMT soldiers who were forced by the Japanese army to work as coolies in Papua New Guinea during the war included also members of 800 heroes who fought to defend the Sihang Warehouse in Shanghai. And together with the remains of soldiers from Burma and India that belonged to the Chinese Expeditionary Force between 1941 and 45, the Taiwanese government also collected since 2000 the ashes of the dead soldiers from former World War II battlefield overseas, including, as I said, Bangladesh, New Guinea, India, and Burma, and set the memorial tablets in Taipei's Martyrs Shrine. And even wartime animal traveling subjects connected memory of the war monuments, following the post-war exiles of people across the Taiwan Strait. Ling Wang, who lived really long, an elephant that was captured in Burma by the new First Army from the hand of the Japanese, accompanied the military unit to return to Guangzhou, where it participated as a labor, as a part of the labor force in the construction of the cemetery I showed you in Guangzhou. It was later also transferred to Taipei with Sun Lizhen's own relocation to Taiwan. And then the elephant became the most popular star animal in Taiwan until its death in 2003. And the last two chapters of Guangzhou and the Chongqing are actually most closely related in terms of the lineage between Guo Yuanxi and Li Lunjie, who actually was, like Guo Yuanxi was teacher of Li Lunjie in Xiangqing University in Guangzhou in the 1930s. And so they share this very rare kind of, aesthetical choice of war monuments in China. And both of them are involved in this magazine called the Neue Baukunst that was published by the Xiangqing University in Guangzhou at that time. And the magazine is really passionately introducing Bauhaus architecture or other architectural modernism to the Chinese students. And so the last two war monuments in Guangzhou and Chongqing poses a parallel, if not contesting force in Chinese architectural modernism vis-a-vis that the colonial modernism in Hong Kong and the Chinese classical ritual style in Taipei. So meanwhile, there are also missing connections that these monuments are unable to cover, or this book unable to cover. While the commemoration of the victims of a Japanese air bombing in the 1940s was fully legitimate in Chongqing, those who died in the Taihoku air raid in Taipei, launched by an allied force of the US and the Nationalist Chinese Air Force on May 31st, 1945, were not mourned until 2014 in an Aboriginal Taya ritual. Legacies of colonialism, Cold War confrontations, the narrative of the Chinese Civil War, the monolithic historiography under internal authoritarianism are all variants that influence the meaning and visibility of the war commemorative artifacts in the three Chinese societies. So yes, so basically that's what I would like to share with you about my book. Thank you very much for listening.
All right, thank you, Dr. Pan, for the very rich talk, isn't it, right? Dr. Pan has show us multiple layers of history involved in the constructions of a monument, and how monument has been reinterpreted, and how monument sometimes can help us forget history as well. So I think the second issue, monument can help us forget history, is particularly revealing in the case of the monument in Guangzhou, which you have shown us, right? Because the monument when it was constructed in, when was it again? 30s?
After the war.
Okay, after the war in the 40s. So the architect or designer at that time, it adopted the Beaux-Arts design, right? But later on, the function of that monument was transformed into a public bathroom and then some sort of retail store. So that part of elaboration shows how monument can forget. But I'm very interested in how monument can help us remember a war. Specifically, if you can use the example of the Sihang Memorial Museum to show us, that would be great. So the specific question I want to ask you is that when the Sihang Memorial Museum established in 2015, right? So who were the authority or the research team or in the more academic terms, social political agents have the authority to, for instance, collect information, to design how to reconstruct traces of war and project it or include into that facade, right, of the building, or maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, in order to help the society, people in 2015 to remember a war that happened many times ago. And especially they utilize some sort of photography, right, film, originally produced and circulated in Japan. And I'm sure that the way those film and photographs were understood in Japan probably will be very different from how political authority in 2015 in Shanghai want people to remember. So it seems that there's some sort of, I can imagine that there could be some sort of misinterpretation, or maybe some messages are lost in translation when some sort of visual details are extracted from visual culture in Japan to visual culture in Shanghai in 2015. Yeah, so that's my question.
Okay. Okay, so thank you for actually very specific question, right? This is about like who in the before the construction of the Sihang Warehouse Museum, who collected these images, or who were taking the lead in all these like ideas. Now this is a long story because I cannot elaborate in my talk, but of course the Sihang Warehouse, as I said, was not really like built as as a whole as a war monument, but actually in 1985. When the it's opening up and China was more open to various different kinds of war narrative, there was already this very small room or very small plaque kind of thing erected around the warehouse. Okay, so so basically the warehouse is not. It could not be demolished because it's recognized as an important memorial site. And but however, still until like between 85 to 2015, there's no big actions that were done to change the status quo of the warehouse until I think there was this urban renewal project that's going on around that area. So the real estate development that began to touch upon that area. And so they realized, okay, here is a cultural memorial or some site that potentially would bring more value to the price of that area, And so, of course, there were other reasons like the 70th anniversary of the war, and also, China is also, mainland China, Chinese government is also trying to be more comprehensive in its war narrative. I think you can see that also exactly in that year, 2015, when the starting year of what would like a Sino-Japanese war was moved earlier to 1931. Like previously, it's always 37. Okay, so there will be a changed kind of war narrative. So many different variants and factors that bring back the memory. So I have this conclusion with the Sihang Warehouse and many war monuments in China. It's not necessarily this very strong consciousness of bringing back the memory that make this thing happen, but there is always something else, okay, that make this thing become more valuable or urgent, that the memory were brought back. And the same thing is for another case I wrote previously about the Jewish Refugees Museum in Shanghai. And so I think one of the most important reasons why this memory was rediscovered was also related to, the establishment of Sino-Israel diplomatic relations in 1992, and also in 2010 when the Shanghai Expo was held. That was also something, the Jewish legacies in Shanghai also become a very important cultural capital for promoting Shanghai image to the world. So there are a lot of, contemporary reasons that bringing the past back. But these reasons may not be, oh, we want to remember, Yeah, that's my experience.
Okay, so I will have a follow-up question, but in the meantime, I encourage audience online first. Please feel free to type your question in the chat box because this talk is also delivered on Zoom right now. And for the audience in the room, please also formulate your question and raise your hand if you have anything to ask. Okay, I will ask the follow-up question later.
Okay.
All right, the gentleman there, please. Please use
yeah.
the mic so that everybody can hear you clearly.
But I don't know if...
I thought the talk was really interesting. One thought that crossed my mind as you talked about the 5 monuments, the one that I knew absolutely zero about was the cemetery at Guangzhou. And it got me thinking that maybe one of the reasons why that monument has less of a claim on the public consciousness is that, unlike the other monuments, it didn't have to be in Guangzhou. There was nothing specific about Guangzhou. Maybe, the Wampo Academy, something like that. That monument could have been in Kunming, could have been in Chongqing, whereas the Sohan Warhouse can only be in Shanghai. The Cenotaph, okay, Hong Kong, the Chongqing Monument, so the bombing only there. And then the Taiwan Monument, okay, it's in Taipei, right by the Grand Hotel. But why was that monument located in Guangzhou in the first place? And does the location of a monument somehow affect how people feel about it later? If there isn't that very, very direct connection between what the monument is supposed to be commemorating and the place in which it's located.
Yeah, can I start? I don't know if people online can hear the question. So just very briefly, the question is about why the Guangzhou monument was built in Guangzhou. Yeah, it's because when Sun Liren, after the war, Sun Liren came back to Guangzhou to take the power. And so at that time, basically Guangzhou is his territory. And so he was, if the civil war didn't happen, this would be his place. And so he actually, Sun Liren was also very eager. He's very conscious about building monuments. So even during the war in Burma and the border, he already began to build monuments for his soldiers. And so that's why when he went back to Guangzhou, he wanted to immediately start to build this monument. So with no delay. So we want to start immediately. And a lot of the labor involved in building the Guangzhou monument were the Japanese, what's the term? The BOWs, yes. So he has this urge to build it immediately in his territory. And this question about why in that particular place is also a very good question, because I spend a lot of time talking about why in my book, because if we go to Guangzhou today, you might know the center of Guangzhou is the Sun Yat-sen Memorial Hall. That's the center. And the Sun Yat-sen Memorial Hall, the designer of it is same as the Sun Yat-sen Mausoleum in Nanjing. And so the style is the ritual, classical ritual style. And that is really occupying already the center. And so Sun Liren was thinking, I will start in a different place. And so this cemetery was built on the northeast side of Guangzhou. And it's because it has a hill there. And so he intentionally built this entire cemetery starting from the lower, like the feet of the hill, all the way up, up according to this geographical feature of that area. And that area also speaks to a little bit down in the south, you have the Xianlie Lu, the Martyrs Road, and all these other monuments or sites that's commemorating the nationalist soldiers or the revolutionaries died since the early 20th century. So he was trying to, I won't say it's a competition, but it will be something different from the originally very established, no matter style or meaning of the center of the Guangzhou in terms of commemorating Sun Yat-sen and the Republican regime. He's really thinking about commemorating the fallen soldiers that he really felt the urge to do that. Thank you for the question, and so I can explain a little bit more about that.
I cannot open the chat. No response. Oh, okay. It's not.
Okay.
Do you want to read it out? Oh, I read.
You.
Okay. All right. So let me read out the question posed by an audience online. His name is Terence Kwok. It is interesting that this research addressed how the authority tends to change the narratives and select what to remember and how we should remember. Collective memory could only be passed on, contested, or overruled if people are engaged in the mediation of war memories. Did the book address how these monuments and the visual representations are being understood by their visitors?
Thank you. This is also a question I hear very often, even if in the earliest stage of my research. So yes, this is really something I didn't, I didn't do many interviews with the visitors or surveys with the visitors or do like more in-depth interviews with the visitors. This is not really much included, but as I also briefly talked about, the artworks in the very last chapter, I think they are also visitors, although they are very, they shared their understanding of the monuments in the artistic form. Yeah, so by writing that chapter, I was trying to also see how, users of these monuments today might look at these monuments. Yes, thank you.
Gentleman there.
Thank you for your fascinating talk and then your explanation of war memories to despite one question. My question is also related to the previous.
We need to repeat the question a little bit.
Yeah, I think you cannot hear, right? So there are three questions. I quickly recap. The first question is how come I get to know the monument in Guangzhou, and second is how do I comment on erasure of the memory, especially in the case of Sun Liren, because when he after he went to Taiwan, actually he had this problem with the Chang's family, so his memory or things related to him were also, kind of erased in Taiwan too, right? So not only in mainland China. And the third question is, do I also include museum studies methodology in my research, right? So, okay, the three questions. The first question, it's really an accident, like it's not expected. My friend, an art historian in Guangzhou, he knows this monument from a book, which is published now, actually. It's a book for popular reading. And the book is basically, search for historical relics in Guangzhou. And he came across this one, and because the monument, as you can see, the design of it is very rare in war monuments in China. And so the architecture and also the design of the eagle designer is another very important you can say designer and a sculptor in China, which is also forgotten for some time. So he talked to me about this monument, and I found great interest in that in the monument. And while we were having this conversation about the monument, someone like next to us, he was also a friend of my friend. But he was saying, he tried to join our conversation. He's saying, by saying, oh, is that the monument you were talking about? And we say, yes, so we want to visit the monument, but it's impossible because it's within a military zone. You cannot get in. And so he said, I was in the army, and I might help you to get into the Zoom. And so we had this chance to get into the Zoom. And to see how it is now, so it was really like a very interesting kind of, unexpected kind of relations that we with the help of a friend. But in the meanwhile, as I showed you, the pavilion is in a wet market. Everyone can see it. Just nobody knows what it is. So why we have built an old pavilion here in the wet market? So we also went to these other relics and also check, so and basically that's how I get to know and got the chance maybe 6 years ago already to visit the monument. And the erasure. Yeah, I mean, it could be a physical hidden, like you can hide it physically, like the one in Guangzhou. But I mean, especially the case in Chongqing, right? So we talk so much about the Jiefang Bei, right? And so even by changing its name, you can erase its memory. So it's not until recently that people realize Jiefang Bei is not for the Civil War, right? Jiefang Bei is for the Sino-Japanese War. So there are a lot of different ways to erase. You can hide something, you can rename something, you can demolish it. Of course, it's the most easiest way. You can, like in the case of Sihang Warehouse, you can just rent it out for commercial purposes. Yeah, so I mean, but they are all public architecture. So so once the memory of them are bringing back, it will really exert a large influence. So that's why I also find that they're important. It's not only about something that you cannot see or you need to have the access to see. You can see it in your everyday life. And I didn't talk much about the inside of the museum, like the exhibition's narrative and the objects inside. I didn't spend much time talking about that. So if museums, at least a part of the museum studies are about that. So that was not my approach. So the reason is also, I mentioned I'm really interested in the visual aspects. So the visual aspects, including the design, the visual style of the monument itself, as well as representation, in photography, painting, and film, and also its, the monument's connection with the urban history. So if I go inside the museum and talk about the details of what is inside, I think that it will be another book. So thank you.
Okay, any more questions? Okay.
Thanks very much for the talk. I've got a question. partly related to what you told us about. And that's the structure with the four columns. In Singapore, the civil war memorial, which is down in the civic system, has four columns. And the justification, or the explanation for that, is that that represents the four different groups of Singaporean society: the Chinese, the Malays, the Indians, and the Eurasians. And that's putting them in no particular order of thought. And I just wondered whether there was a similar theme or a similar explanation for the four columns in the modern image.
Oh, thank you. This is another good question, also concerning the symbolism of the monuments. And actually, there were different versions of interpretations. But one interpretation is also the four columns are related to the if I don't remember wrong, it's one version saying it's related to the Confucian idea of Li Yi Lian Chi, the four mean, how to translate them, the four major virtues you need to have as a person, but also as an army, like for military people in Confucianism. But there were also other interpretations, like the four spirits that are like related to the new First Army and other things. But I think yes, it has its own symbolic meaning here. And actually, in the case in Chongqing, they also have the four-face clock and the four-face relief. They are also has this similar kind of allusion to the Confucian virtues. And why is, I think, in the nationalist national building, especially the Zhang government, they have this very, like, they emphasize a lot on the Confucian teaching to build this new Republican China. And so in Zhang's ideology, you can see all the time these kind of Confucian teachings, and the number four and the four virtues are all often mentioned. Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Any more questions? Audience in the room or audience online? We also take questions as in maybe Cantonese or Mandarin if you feel more comfortable to pose it that way. Any more? Okay, follow-up question from the gentleman there.
Yes, this is actually on a completely different subject. You mentioned that the colonial government on Remembrance Day would go first to the arch, the Botanical Gardens, before coming down to the ceremony at the Senate. Now, the chief executive has never been to the ceremony at the Senate since 1997. Well, so that's never. Anyway, I just wondered whether the chief executive on Remembrance Day goes to that arch, or whether that's something else, another tradition which has disappeared.
Can you?
Yeah, does the chief executive of Hong Kong on Remembrance Day, or on the day where they ceremony for in honor of the patriotic Chinese who died fighting the Imperial Japanese aggressor, which takes place at City Hall, whether the chief executive still goes to that arch to be built to commemorate the Chinese, Hong Kong Chinese War, or whether that has disappeared off the chief executive's calendar.
You mean why after 1997 chief executive don't pay visit on the day to the arch, or It's actually in the colonial period. It's actually the itinerary is actually the arch, the cenotaph, and the St. John's Cathedral. That's the line. And so after 1997, I think there's no more Remembrance Day here in Hong Kong, but Chongyang Festival around the second Sunday or somewhere around that in October was now the day for remembering the fallen during the war, and so the chief executive went to the city hall. So that's the only place I think the ceremony is held. So the arch is not.
Sorry, I'll just correct you.
Okay.
The Remembrance Day commemoration takes place every year.
Yeah.
And it's done so since 1997. It took place last Sunday, despite COVID restrictions. So that ceremony is continued. What it lacks is presence of the chief executive.
Yes. No. That's what I mean. The official Remembrance Day, like the government-led Remembrance Day ritual, is no longer held at the cenotaph. But of course, the non-governmental, non-official ones are still held. Yes. So I'm talking about the government one with the chief executive ones are no longer in cenotaph, of course, but they also don't visit the arch anymore.
There's a right said, hi Lu, thank you for the wonderful talk. Can you perhaps unpack the notion of authenticity, that is, in the simulation of bullet holes in Sihang Memorial Museum, and that of object versus image centrism you mentioned?
Oh, thank you. So that's because, as I said, the Sihang warehouse today is not a real ruin, right? It's an artificial ruin. It's a ruin that were built based on the old photographs, from the war period. So there are not so many artificial ruins used as war monuments in China today, I think. And so I began to wonder why these artificial ruins were built. And so if you ask the designers or the idea, where the idea come from, they of course don't say so much about the authenticity and these terms that we use to analyze. So this is the term I use to analyze, to try to understand or to interpret why this happened and what interesting things we can find about Chinese war monuments. So the authenticity here is usually in English, we talk about the truthness, like say, okay, Sihang warehouse was where the battle happened, right? So this is authentic. But the bullet holes was not, they were man-made, right? So for people who are more concerned with the authenticity of everything, right? So you might say, oh, why don't we have all these fake bullet holes or, war relics or the ruins? We should just keep it as a war. However, you need to understand in the first place that there's no more war relics left on the building because, as I said, there were a lot of other uses, functions that were applied, to this building. And so my understanding is today's museum designer or today's museum builder of Sihang Warehouse Museum, they really don't care about, or they're not bothered by this so-called inauthenticity of these bullet holes in order just to reach this spectacle, effect of spectacle of bringing you back to the historical site. And so I think you can find a lot of cases in contemporary Chinese cities of rebuilding or man-made or artificial, 古迹, the old relics. And so I won't say this is wrong or this is something that we should condemn. No, I'm also not saying this dichotomy between the original and the fake is the only criteria that we need to understand or judge, the building of the quality of the museum. I just want to explain, at least in the case of Sihang Warehouse, the designer, they don't really care. And I found that's really interesting. Yeah, thank you.
So just one thing to clarify, so was it that at some point during the lifetime of the Sihang Warehouse, the bullet holes were repaired by the owner of the warehouse in specific historical time? Because I'm thinking that after the World War II, right, during the war, there were really bullet holes left on the building, right?
Yeah.
Was it at some point those holes or traces of the war were gone because of man-made repairing?
Yes.
Okay.
Actually, right after the war and during the Wang Jingwei time, the Sihang Warehouse has returned its function as a central market, actually. So I think even before 1945, all these bullet holes were already gone. And so, after 1949 and all these years, I think all these, they must be renovating it a lot. So, but the battle, the legacies of the battle were long gone, even before the war ended.
The follow-up question I wanted to ask is that because Dr. Pan was born and she grew up in Shanghai, so my question is, do you remember how you understood the Sihang Warehouse when you were little or in your teenage, and or how did your parents' generation know about the history of the building itself?
Sihang Warehouse that's why I also spent the longest time, I think, talking about Sihang Warehouse. I think I have the deepest connection with that. I think when I was young, that area was famous for wholesale of stationery. So it's basically
Stationery.
stationery,
What kind of stationery?
like a pen and different kinds of notebooks. So that's a place where you don't really connect it with bloody war or battles, but because my previous research was also on memory and the city, and at a certain point I realized Sihang Warehouse is important, and also actually the road in front of it is also related to I think to the battle. And we still have in Shanghai, we have a Jingyuan Middle School named after the colonel, the Xie Jingyuan. And so we know about the history, but the space itself is basically not used as a monument, not used as a museum. And so in 2008, when I tried to pay a visit to this house, it's very fashionable at that time, so-called creative center, where you have creative centers. Yeah, so where you have all these, photo studios or, different companies. But on the top of the building, there is a temporary structure. And inside, it's a very small kind of exhibition space to tell you the history about the battle. But what is really interesting is there is a bronze statue of Xie Jingyuan in the exhibition space. And when I visited the space, I found that Xie Jingyuan is having this red scarf of the young pioneers because that space has become a so-called patriotic education center. And so sometimes school kids will come visit this space, and as a ritual, they will tie a red scarf from the youth league, communist youth league, on the neck of Xie Jingyuan. That's really an interesting moment for me, and so that was really also a stimuli for me to start the whole project in some way. Yeah.
So we have one final question online.
Okay,
Do you
I
think
think
you want to take it or?
I think this is the very last question.
Okay, yeah, very last question. All right. It's also posed by the audience online earlier. Do you see the authorities who are in charge of the museum emphasize more about experiential authenticity or subjective authenticity rather than objective authenticity? Is it a common practice in China and Taiwan?
Well, I mean, one thing I have to say is when we talk about authenticity, it's also like, for example, there are two things I want to add. One is the original design, the facade, and also not the entire inner structure of the warehouse, but partly was restored during this time of the like construction of the museum. In that sense, they really want to be faithful to the original, unlike the Wulihe Wall. But so this is really what they can do because they all have the design sketches and they consulted architecture experts. So if you go to Sihanouk Warehouse today, you can see the architectural details are restored and in a pretty good way actually. However, what is also very interesting about the authenticity is also related to the previous question about what is exhibited in the museum. The museum director told me actually it is so difficult to find original things that are related to the battle and the soldiers, like objects, like for example, helmet used by the soldiers, or things that were from that period of time. It's so difficult for them to find them. So if you go to the museum and experience the museum space, a lot of them are like the screening or a recreation of the battle scene. And so he said he told me actually that's the biggest challenge for the museum because you have such a big space, but you don't have the original things to be displayed. So the authenticity is also conditioned, and it's not that you won't have the original and you can have So there are a lot of reasons and factors that constrain this authenticity, but they somehow try to make that narrative make sense in a way. Yeah. So that's the two more information I want to add.